Alyson Marcucio. I'm a partner at Mizuko, and I've been with the firm for 2 months. And I'm going to be talking to you, giving you tidbits of information, not just on Medicaid, but on just different issues affecting seniors, long-term care type issues. So not going to be limited just to Medicaid. So I'm sure most of you, if not all of you, at some time have watched a medical drama like Ben Casey or General Hospital. One of my favorites was Emergency, MASH. Maybe more recently you find yourself binge watching, I guess that's the new term, binge watching shows like ER or Grey's Anatomy or House or Private Practice. But if none of those medical dramas caught your attention, I know I steer away from the legal dramas, I tend to watch the medical dramas. But if the legal dramas are more appealing to you, then perhaps you've watched shows like Ally McBeal or Boston Legal, or Law and Order, perhaps CSI, or Matlock or Perry Mason. But I'm willing to bet that I'm one of very few people, or maybe the only person in this room, that watched recently on Netflix the original documentary called Extremis. Anybody watch that? Kind of figured. Extremis is a documentary briefly showing how the medical and legal communities overlap when families are faced with having to make end-of-life care decisions. So why is it that we don't see on television shows called Sally Ran Away with Mom's Money? Why is it that the only time we see something on television that deals with elder abuse or granny snatching is on an episode of 2020 after a senior has already been exploited? Why is it that we might not be aware of steps that we can take to help our family member with dementia from being on the news in the form of a silver missing person alert? Why is it? Because unlike the medical and legal dramas that I mentioned a few seconds ago, we watch those for pure entertainment, maybe for relaxation. Whereas a show about sensitive end-of-life care issues or estate planning issues or neglect or isolation of seniors, it's probably not a show that we're as likely to watch, or that a television writer is going to write a show about, because probably not going to catch an audience that's keep their attention. And why do we steer away from those shows? Because there's sensitive topics, and I think most of us think it's not going to happen in our family. It happens to other people, not us. Regardless of how far away from these topics we would like to stay, reality is that we are all aging and that we're all going to die at some point. So wouldn't you rather have a say in how you live your life rather than living in fear that you might lose control of the decision making in the future? So tonight, like I said, in the short time I have with you, I want to touch just on a few things that I've run across over the years, just tidbits of information that affect seniors, and not only seniors, but individuals with disabilities. And I'm just hoping that you can walk away with a few tidbits of information and maybe encourage you to address some of the end-of-care life decisions and some of your estate planning issues, now, while you're able to think through things clearly and make an informed decision about, what direction you want and how your care needs, how you want to be taken care of in the future. So I'm just going to start by talk to you briefly about what is elder law. A lot of people ask me what areas of law do I practice in, and of course my big area is elder law. And elder law, it's not a specialty per se, but it's more about assisting clients and their families in navigating the financial, legal, healthcare, and social services systems. So I find that often I'm not just a lawyer, but I'm a social worker too. So it combines the social aspects with the legal aspect, which is kind of nice. And elder law covers a wide range, as you can see, of different areas. Public benefits, Medicaid, Title 19 planning, special needs planning, housing, employment, retirement, patient rights, resident rights, estate planning, legal capacity. So it really runs the gamut. One of the topics that is often at the forefront of a conversation is Medicare. And Medicare most times seems like you're saying the alphabet. You have Medicare A, B, C, D, so on. I don't know how many letters we're up to now, and then trying to figure out which part pays for what services and how to navigate the Medicare system. It's quite confusing. And then that's not enough. Then there's exceptions to the Medicare rules to complicate things even further. So on the positive side, there's some Medicare savings programs that some people qualify for, depending on your income, that help pay for Medicare deductibles and co-pays. On the not so positive side, there's the things like observation status in the improvement standard, which aim to cut your Medicare coverage short. And observation status means when you're in a hospital, you need a 3-day inpatient stay at the hospital in order for Medicare to cover any of your stay in a skilled nursing facility. So if you have to go for a short-term rehab in a nursing home, for example, after a hospital stay, you have to have 3 days inpatient. And unfortunately, sometimes, and quite often actually, you'll be in a hospital and you'll be on observation status rather than inpatient. And observation status does not count as an inpatient stay. So if you're in the hospital, it could be in an emergency room, you could actually be up on the floor and on observation status. And if you're on observation status and never get that 3 days of inpatient, they never admit you, then when you go to that nursing home, after 3-4 days or whatever the case may be, Medicare is not going to pay for your stay in the skilled nursing facility. So it's important to know what your status is when you're in the hospital. I was actually at a hospital recently, and I heard the nurses telling a patient that or actually a family member telling him that his wife was on observation status, and I almost jumped up and wanted to just let him know what that meant, but I didn't. So then if you get past the hurdle of observation status and you've actually had a 3-day inpatient stay at a hospital and you go into the rehab, then we have the next standard, the improvement standard. So typically, once you have that 3-day stay, you'll have up to 100 days paid for by Medicare in a skilled nursing facility. But the 100 days isn't given. And it's not a given that you're going to get the full 100 days. And the first 20 days, it's 100%, and then the next 80 days, there's a 20% copayment. But because of this improvement standard, there's a possibility that at some point during your stay at the skilled nursing facility, you're going to get a notice of non-coverage, 2 days advance notice saying, hey, Medicare is not going to cover for your skilled nursing care anymore because you're not improving anymore. And there is a court case, the GMO case, that efforts to change the standard from an improvement standard to a maintenance standard, but it's still not. The facilities and Medicare, everybody still hasn't gotten their act together, so there is still some problems in terms of the coverage for the Medicare and the improvement standard. So when you get this notice of non-coverage, we all say, oh yeah, we have to read everything before we sign it, but you're in a hospital and either you're given this notice as a patient or a family member, and here, sign here, and you sign there. But what you might be doing is giving up your appeal rights. So it's always important to read that notice that you're given that's telling you that Medicare is going to stop covering as of a certain day, because you want to make sure that you're checking the right box to retain your appeal rights, just in case you don't agree with the decision that Medicare is going to stop paying. There are self-help guides on the Medicare website, and I've included that website in your packet to help with navigating improvement standard and observation status. And probably be a good idea just to take a look at them at some point, because especially with the observation status, it's really a scary thing to all of a sudden be in a position where you think Medicare is going to pay for your stay, rehab stay, and surprise, they're not going to, and then you're in a situation where you have to try to appeal it. So move on to housing options. Seniors are fortunate. There's so many housing options available now, and of course you have, you could stay home, and most of us want to stay home, which I'll get into that with the next slide. But there's some things that are important to consider when you're thinking about where you're going to live or where a family member is going to live, especially if there's a memory impairment. Because people with memory impairment, a change in residence can be very confusing and upsetting for people. So when looking at different housing options, there's a number of different facilities that have a continuum of care these days. And it's a continuum of care, so you might have a section that's independent living, and then there's assisted living, and then skilled nursing, kind of all under one roof or on the same grounds, which is kind of nice because there's some familiarity for the resident, and may reduce the confusion for a person with memory impairment. But one thing to keep in mind when you're looking at these facilities, in the continuum of care facilities and things like that, is whether or not the facility accepts Medicaid. Now, Medicaid, or Title 19, is assistance in helping to pay for long-term care. So Medicaid's not going to pay for your stay in an assisted living facility. But again, if you're looking at a continuum of care type of facility, you want to make sure that if you get into the skilled nursing end of care, do they accept Medicaid? So that's a question you want to be asking when you're going in for independent living, because if your thought process is, I want to stay at this facility from through all the continuum of care, then you don't want to get to the point where you're in skilled nursing and all of a sudden you have to move because they don't accept Medicaid. So it's a good thing to find out, again, right when you're going into the facility. And then with skilled nursing facility admissions, it's very important to review, whether it's for yourself or a family member, review the admissions agreements prior to signing them, especially if you are signing them as an agent under a power of attorney for a family member, or I've had situations where a neighbor is being helpful and bringing their friend to a skilled nursing facility, so they're helping them fill out the admissions paperwork. And there's something called responsible party, and you don't want to be signing an admissions agreement in a nursing home or another facility without knowing what you're signing up for. What responsibilities are you taking on if you're signing that agreement? There's probably the smartest thing that you can do, don't feel pressured to sign that agreement on the spot. Ask them if you could take it home, review it, either review it yourself, review it with an attorney, to make sure that you know what you're signing on for. And the best practice, if the patient or the resident is able to sign the agreement themselves, then that's the best case scenario. Okay, so home care considerations. Again, most people want to stay in their own home. who wouldn't want to stay home? You're comfortable, it's familiar, independence, and cost effective, but sometimes unfortunately it's not possible because care needs are too extensive or whatever the case may be. There are programs available to help you stay in your home. Connecticut Home Care Program for the Elders is a program, has state funding to assist people to remain in their home. It wouldn't pay for 24-hour care, but at least it might supplement some out-of-pocket expense. There are financial and functional eligibility requirements in order to qualify for the Connecticut Home Care Program, but it's an option. Sometimes children take on the responsibility of caring for their parents, and in doing so, maybe they're giving up a job because one of their parents or both of their parents need full-time care, or maybe they're giving up have to work part-time in order to take care of mom or dad. So there's personal care contracts that can be done, and it could be beneficial to parent and child, so some compensation for a child, but they need to be in writing and things like that. And so if you ever get into a situation where you think, care at home with a caregiver child type of situation, then consult with an attorney about how a personal care contract might be beneficial to your family. And then, of course, there's always the hiring home care workers from an agency. And the biggest thing that you should be aware of when hiring home care workers is before you hire that home care worker, it's always a smart thing to consult with a tax advisor or legal counsel prior to doing so, because you don't know whether they're going to be treated as independent contractors or whether you're going to end up being an employer responsible for your own tax withholding and having to pay unemployment taxes and things like that. Some agencies work as with independent contractors, and others it's an employer-employee relationship. So you definitely don't want to get into a situation where suddenly you're an employer and that's not what you want it to be. So it's a good idea prior to hiring a home care worker, again, even if it's through an agency, just consult with a tax advisor or an attorney to make sure you understand the income tax consequences to you. I know, I'm jumping around. I'm trying to cover a whole bunch of information in a short time, but again, these are all things I've run across, and I think they're really important for people to know. So forgotten and unknown assets. Who wouldn't love, to all of a sudden discover there's an asset out there they, forgot about or, unknown. The Connecticut Big List. Unclaimed property that's, property that's escheated to the state. Maybe there's a life insurance policy that mom or dad had, and I'll talk about that in a second, that went unclaimed and escheated to the state. What I do from time to time is, for some of my family members, I'll go on the Connecticut Big List. I included the website online. You put in your name, you see if there's any property out there, that is unclaimed, and then there's a process you go through to claim that property. Life insurance, I think, is probably, it's probably one of the biggest assets that goes unclaimed, because a lot of times there's no nationwide registry or statewide registry of life insurance. What policies you purchased, or maybe a parent purchased for you when you were born, and so nobody knows, what policies are out there other than you. So I think it's a good practice to make a list of life insurance policies that you have, with the name of the company and the policy number, and kind of keep that list in a place where your kids or the beneficiaries of those policies know where they can find that list. Because again, if you don't have a list, and maybe you don't even know where the policy is, it could go back 30 years, 40 years, you purchase a policy. then upon your death, there's no way of knowing for sure whether your children are going to find the policy or even know that asset exists. So it's a good idea just to have a list of, the life insurance policies somewhere. And then also savings bonds. I mean, I know savings bonds, people, that was like the big thing, H bonds, EE bonds, E bonds, and now I don't think you could even cash them in. I don't even think you could buy them at a bank anymore. I think you have to do it all online through Treasury Direct, which I included that website, and register them and cash them in, surrender them through the website. So that, again, another asset that you may have these savings bonds that are sitting in, a strong box or a safe that you kind of forgot about. And it's just kind of a good idea to take an inventory for yourself to see, okay, what do I have? And it's one of those assets I always ask people, do you have any savings bonds that you might have forgotten about? Because again, I think it's an asset that kind of gets put aside and, we kind of forget about. And then the other thing is life insurance demutualization. In the early 2000s, there were MetLife, Prudential, John Hancock, they demutualized and they converted to a publicly traded stock company. They issued stock to their policyholders. So it's another asset that people don't always know that they have. They have shares of stock in MetLife or John Hancock or Prudential, and maybe not a lot of shares, but again, it's an asset that's out there. And a lot of times when I'm doing a Medicaid application, that's when we find out that a person has, 40 shares of stock in MetLife, maybe a couple $1,000s, which is, a nice thing, but it would probably be better to know that before we're applying for Medicaid, because we can use that money to, to benefit you. Okay. So you check with, your insurance. If you've had policies with MetLife, Prudential, or John Hancock, you might want to check with those companies to see, maybe you have some stock out there. They're not they don't hold the stock. It's Computer Share or BNY Mellon that holds the shares of stock, but at least they could probably direct you where to go in order to find out whether you actually do hold the stock. All right, upon the death of a spouse, obviously it's an emotional hardship when a spouse dies, but you also become a target. I was at a client's house a few weeks ago, and there's a knock on the door. Her husband passed away a couple weeks prior, and knock on the door, it's a contractor trying to sell her a lawn care service, and kind of chased the contractor away, and 15 minutes later he's back again trying to talk to her again. And unfortunately, some contractors and scam artists, they're reading the obituaries and trying to find out who's vulnerable, and they're finding out who the widows are, who the widowers are, and they're targeting these people and trying to sell them unwanted services. Oh, you need a new roof, or how about new windows, or the lawn care service or something like that. And then rise in the financial exploitation and things like that, because again, you're vulnerable and they're trying to sell you things or get you to donate money when you're vulnerable. So just be vigilant of an increase in phone calls and things like that. And then the other thing, and I've been running into this a little bit more recently, and I know it happens, but for some reason it's affecting my clients recently, is the loss of income upon the death of a spouse. A spouse might be receiving a pension income, and depending on what option they selected when they retired, that pension would stop at the death of that spouse, and that could be a significant decrease in income. And then in addition, if you're receiving Social Security, the two of you, a spouse dies, you're down to one Social Security income, and it'd be the higher of the two. But again, you could go from maybe somebody's getting a decent Social Security check, a decent pension, and now all of a sudden there goes $4,000 of income a month. So it's important to plan ahead and kind of have a conversation now about what would happen if this spouse died or that spouse died, what would the decrease in income be? Or even when you're facing retirement, what option do you pick? Do you pick the lesser pension now so that it would continue when you die? Or do you, take the full pension now? And kind of budgeting a little bit to just in case, the death of that spouse, that the income disappears. So I know that I've had some clients, again, recently that have been really affected and can't continue to pay their mortgage. Rich briefly was talking about power of attorney and conservator, and I just wanted to briefly talk about, power of attorney versus the conservator of the estate, and a healthcare representative versus a conservator of the person. What's the difference? Okay, power of attorney, you name an agent, somebody to act for you with respect to your financial decisions. Sometimes the agent under the power of attorney isn't acting and isn't handling your finances appropriately, so it may become necessary for the appointment of a conservator of the estate, and that's through the probate court, and it's under the probate court jurisdiction with accountings to the probate court. So an agent under the power of attorney and a conservator of the estate, they serve the same role, but again, one is under the jurisdiction of the probate court and the power of attorney is not. Healthcare representative or conservator of the person. Again, they serve the same role, but a conservator of the person is under the probate court jurisdiction, whereas a healthcare representative is not. And there's some times when it becomes necessary for a conservator of the person because the healthcare representative is not handling things appropriately, okay? Or maybe there's conflict between children, there's multiple siblings and disagreeing about how things should be handled, and mom or dad is now, the capacity is questionable, so it becomes necessary to appoint a conservator. What's meant by avoiding probate? Now, that's like a whole topic for its own seminar, but I just wanted to briefly mention. You hear people talking about, I want to avoid probate, and when people come to me and say, I want to avoid probate, I say, well, what are you trying to avoid? Are you trying to avoid the cost? Or are you trying to avoid having anything filed with probate court? And I said, and I always tell them, there's no way of avoiding having to file at least one piece of paper with the probate court. It doesn't matter how your assets are titled, solely owned, jointly owned, they could all have a beneficiary. There's at least statutorily required one form that's going to have to be filed with the probate court. So if you're looking to avoid probate court entirely, by statute, you can't avoid it entirely, okay? But by titling your assets joint or having beneficiary designations and things like that, you could speed up the process, the probate process, and you could avoid having the probate court have jurisdiction over your assets. But again, you have at least that one piece of paper that needs to be filed with the court. What happens to your assets if you don't have a will? Having a will is a critical piece of your estate, of any long-term care planning or estate plan. Because if you don't have a will, then statute is going to determine what happens to your assets. So you run the risk that your assets are going to end up in the hands of unintended beneficiaries. Okay, so it's just good to have the will. Some people say, well, I have all my assets are joint, or I have beneficiaries on all my assets, so I don't need a will. Well, again, there's always a chance that there's an asset out there that you forgot about. Okay, so it's just good to have the will, just to make sure that your assets end up where you want them to end up. You're keeping the control, and you're in control of your life. Okay. And then a living will and a do not resuscitate order. I hear people talking about these interchangeably, and it scares me, so I always bring this up, even if it doesn't fit into the presentation. A do not resuscitate order is medical order written by a medical professional that you don't want to, you don't want CPR, for example, when you have a heart attack or something like that. Whereas a living will is if you're terminally ill, permanently unconscious, brain dead, hooked up to machines, keeping you alive, you don't want to be hooked up to those machines. So they're not the same thing. A DNR has to be done by a medical professional, whereas a living will is you're terminally ill, permanently unconscious, brain dead. So you go to a hospital, they say, do you have a living will? And I always think, why do they need to know that? I'm not terminally ill or permanently unconscious, but it's just like a routine question that they ask. So, all right, so Medicaid, or Title 19 in a nutshell. Again, Medicaid is the subject of its own seminar. It's complicated. There's no way of keeping Medicaid in a nutshell. Medicaid, it's financial assistance with the cost of long-term care, home care or skilled nursing facility. Again, the rules are complicated. There's income and asset eligibility requirements. There's 5-year look-back period, so if you've transferred assets that don't fall into exceptions during that 5-year look-back period, then you're not going to be eligible for the Medicaid. It's best to consult with an elder law attorney sooner than later. Even if you don't think it's time, it's always good to have that conversation and start the discussion so you could plan ahead, because you don't want to get into a situation where, none of us have a crystal ball. We don't know when we're going to need care. So it's better just to have that conversation, see what the planning is about, see if there's any planning that you should do that would be beneficial for you. And then if it ends up being too early, then at least you know and you have that education and the information you need. And again, as I said, Medicaid, it's larger than a nutshell because it's so complicated, and there's exceptions to the rules, and everybody's situation is different, and I run into so many different scenarios, and just when I think I've seen it all, there's something else that comes up that you have to see, do we fit into an exception or things like that. And the other thing with Medicaid that I've run into a lot is, I said, if you make transfers during the 5-year look-back period, so 5 years before you apply for Medicaid, then you're not going to be eligible for benefits. And a lot of people say to me, well, I could give away, some people say $11,000 a year or $12,000 a year. The number right now is $14,000 a year. And for gift tax purposes, that's correct. You can give away $14,000 per year per person to as many people as you want and not pay gift tax. However, if you're looking at Medicaid eligibility, if you give $14,000 away, you're going to be ineligible for Medicaid. So it works for gift tax purposes, but it doesn't work for Medicaid eligibility. So again, there's just so many different moving parts and considerations, and so again, that's why it's important to have the conversation early, so you could be. In conclusion, I'd say that some of the key elements to maintaining control of your life as you age are education, action, and vigilance. Even if you have a family member that's supportive and helpful, or multiple family members that are helpful and supportive, it's always a good practice to get a professional on your team, whether it's an accountant, an attorney, financial advisor. Someone outside of the family that knows what your long-term care goals are. Do you want to stay home? Do you, as long as possible, do you want to go into a facility? So they could look out for you also, just in case your family member or family members end up being the exploiters. It happens more often than not that the people that are the exploiters are family members. So again, it's a good idea just to have somebody, professional kind of looking out for you also.